We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Vavam and Aleph in Meseches Sotah. This is Sotah Daf 46a. The Mishnah continues, V'hakohanim omrim, and the Kohanim they say, and Rashi says, V'hakohanim omrim k'dichsiv la'el, like it's written earlier in the pasuk, V'nigshu hakohanim b'nei Levi, v'lo pirish al mihem nigoshim. So it says again that the Kohanim, the b'nei Levi, they come close. It doesn't explain to whom they are coming close, but the Mishnah continues and says, the Kohanim say, Kaper li'amcha Yisrael, asher podiso Hashem v'al titein dam naki, b'kerev amcha Yisrael. It says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you should forgive, you should atone for your nation, Klal Yisrael. Lo hayu tzrichin lomar v'nichaper lohem hadam. Now they don't need to say v'nichaper lohem hadam, ela ruach hakodesh mevasrasim. They don't need to say their line. That's the ruach hakodesh that's informing them. Eimosai shetasu kocha hadam eschaper lohem. Meaning the pasuk is saying when you do the following procedure, so then this blood will be a kapara for you. Rashi over here says, meaning the v'nichaper, that line that's written in the pasuk, that's at the end of the pasuk. The pasuk over here, the full pasuk again, is Kaper l'amcha Yisrael asher padisa Hashem v'al titein dam naki b'kerev amcha Yisrael, and the pasuk ends v'nikaper lahem hadam. So that's lav av'ano v'yamru kai. That's not something that they have to say. It's not going on the line that they answer and they say sheyavze b'chlal amira, that they should have to say this. They don't. Elamilso b'yan pei nafshi. Rather, this is just an independent line in the pasuk. Sheruach hakodesh biser is Yisrael. The ruach hakodesh. The pasuk is informing Klal Yisrael. Al yedei Moshe Rabbeinu, through Moshe Rabbeinu l'chashiyasu kain. When you do this, when they do this, v'nikaper lehem adam. So then the blood will act as an atonement. And in terms of the pasuk of v'nigshu hakohanim that Rashi referenced, Rashi is referring to pasuk Hey. It says v'nigshu hakohanim b'nei Levi. It says the kohanim they approach, but it doesn't say why they're approaching. And it's only in pasuk Ches where it says Kaper li'amcha Yisrael. And so that's what Rashi is referring to. The Mishnah is explaining that's the role of the kohanim. They say this line of Kaper li'amcha Yisrael. And the Gemara says, V'hei mum posel be'egla mikal v'chomer, but we should say that a blemish does disqualify by egla arufa, because we should make the following kal v'chomer. Uma parif, by para aduma, she'ein hashonim poslos, but where there the age of the animal does not disqualify, there's no qualifications when it comes to the age. So mum posel, but by para aduma, if there's a blemish, it is a disqualification. So egla, so when it comes to egla arufa, she'shonim poslos, but where if it gets too old, so then it is disqualified. Eino din she'hei mum posel, but shouldn't it be logical that a blemish should disqualify by egla arufa? And the Gemara answers, Shani Hasam, it's different over there. Diyamar Kra, because the pasuk says Asher ein ba mum, that it doesn't have a mum, meaning by para aduma it says ein ba mum, and we understand that to mean ba mum posel, by it, by the para aduma, a mum disqualifies ve'ein mum posel be'egla, but a mum does not disqualify when it comes to egla arufa. But the Gemara continues, Elamayata, but according to that, lo yuhu shara avodos poslos ba. So then other kinds of work should not disqualify when it comes to the para aduma. Alamam Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Why did Rabbi Yehuda say that Rav said that when it comes to para aduma, it's not only if the yoke is upon it, but even other kinds of work are going to disqualify? It says, Hiniach aleh oda shel sakin, if he puts upon the para aduma a bundle of sacks, psula, that does disqualify. Uve eglen, when it comes to egla arufa, ad shetimshach, until you pull it. And so again, if you're going to say that we make this drasha, meaning this drasha of ba, so it says the word ba by egla arufa as well, so we should say only by egla arufa all kinds of work are going to disqualify. But when it comes to para aduma, all kinds of work don't disqualify, only if it's pulled by the yoke. And to that, the Gemara says, no, Shani Para, it's different by the Para Aduma. Di Alfinon Ol May Egla. We actually make a Gzer Shava. It says Ol by Egla Arufa. It says Ol by Para Aduma. And we understand all the kinds of work that disqualify by Egla Arufa, they are also going to disqualify by Para Aduma. But the Gemara says if you're making a Gzer Shav in one direction, why don't you make it in the other direction? Egla Nami, when it comes to Egla Arufa also, Teise Ol Mi Para, we should do a Gzer Shav of Ol from Para Aduma. And we should say that just like a mum disqualifies by Para Aduma, so to a mum disqualifies by Egla Arufa. And to that the Gemara says, Hamiyet Rachmana Ba. But the pasuk again, the pasuk says Ba by Para Aduma. A mum only disqualifies by Para Aduma and not by Egla Arufa. But the Gemara then goes back and says Egla Nami, when it comes to Egla Arufa as well. Ksiv Ba, it also says the word Ba. And so again, we should say in the other direction, we should say that all kinds of work passel by Egla Arufa, but all kinds of work don't necessarily passel when it comes to Para Aduma. And so the Gemara now says, Ahumi boile, that ba by Egla Arufa, that's coming for a different thing. It's a different exclusion. L'mu'ute kachim, it's to exclude situations of kachim, other kinds of animals that are designated for karbonos. The lo paslabu avoda, we're saying that avoda disqualifies by Egla Arufa, but kachim, karbonos are not disqualified because of avoda. They're not disqualified just because the animal was used for work. And the Gemara explains, I might have thought Lacey bekal v'chomer me'egla. I might have thought we should learn kachim as a kal v'chomer from egla arufa. Uma egla she'ein mum posel, but just like by egla arufa, where a mum does not disqualify, avoda poselos but the work does disqualify. So kachim she'mum poselos behen, kachim where a mum does disqualify, eino din she'avoda poselos behen. Wouldn't it be true that avoda also disqualifies by kachim? You might think that, and that's what the word ba comes to teach us, that avoda does not disqualify when it comes to kachim. But the Gemara says ikal mifrach, but we could refute that kal v'chomer. What kind of kal v'chomer would that even have been? Because we could simply say ma'ale egla shekein shanim poslos ba, just like by egla arufa. Or what do we find unique by egla arufa? That years are also a disqualification, and therefore, if we find by egla arufa that years are a disqualification and by kachim they're not, so you wouldn't necessarily have learned out avoda from egla to kachim. And the Gemara says, well, that wouldn't be a good refutation. Atu kachim mileka de pasli bushanim. When it comes to karbonos, aren't there some karbonos where the age of the animal is a disqualification? So that's not a refutation of that potential kal v'chomer. And the Gemara explains, ki yitzrich kra lahanach kachim de pasli bushanim. So therefore, that's what the pasuk is needed for. For those kachim where shanim is a disqualification, and you might have thought to learn out that by kachim there's also a disqualification of avoda. So that's what the word ba comes to say. There's no disqualification of avoda when it comes to kachim. But the Gemara continues, v'kachim de lo pasla buhu avoda mehacha nafka. The fact that by kachim there's no disqualification of work, is that really learned from here? Mehasam nafka, it's learned from there, it's learned from the following pasuk. It's a different pasuk. The pasuk says, iveris o shav or choretz o yabeles o garav o yalefes, talks about all the different kinds of mum. Lo sakrivu eila l'Hashem. It says you can't bring these animals as a carbon to Hashem. And we learn from there that avoda is not a disqualification, because we learn from the word eila. Eila iyatam makriv. These kind of animals you can't bring. But you're allowed to bring animals as karbonos even if work was done. But the Gemara says, no, we still need the other source. Itzrich, we need our source as well. Sal gadai techamina, because you might have thought, if you only had the first source, you might have thought, hani mili heicha da avad, bohen avodas heter. That's true if you did a kind of work that was mutter. Aval avodas isser, but let's say you did with the animal some kind of work that was prohibited. Emolitzru, I might say that is a prohibition, that is a disqualification. So tzricha, so that's why we need to say any kind of avoda is not going to be a disqualification. But the Gemara says, but that also, the idea of avodas isser, that's not a disqualification, that also comes from here, that also comes from this pasuk that discusses the mums, it discusses the blemishes, because the pasuk says, again it uses the word eila in that same context, and we understand, eila iyata makriv, you can't bring these as a carbon if they have blemishes, avolata makriv kachim shenevda b'hen avoda, but you're allowed to bring karbonos even if work was done. And so then again, so now why do we need our pasuk? Why do we need this third pasuk? And the Gemara says, no, itzrich, it's still needed. Sal gadai dechamina, because I might have thought, hani mili heicha da'avad behen kashein chulin. That's only true if the work was done when they were still chulin, before they were consecrated. Aval avad behen kashein kachim, but maybe you would think that if work was done when it's already been consecrated, when it's already been made hektish, so ein malitzru, I might think that does create a prohibition. I might think that is a disqualification. So tzricha, that's why we need our pasuk as well. And Rashi explains, Egla bas shenasi, an Egla of the Egla Arufa, it has to be a year old. There is another opinion, 2 years old. Rashi is quoting one of the opinions. V'mavra shenasa psulin, if the year goes by, it's disqualified. T'chol makam shenemra b'Torah Egel stam ben shana. When it says in the Torah Egel, generally it refers to 1 year old. And then the Gemara went on to say, Lo yehushar avodos poslos b'para, so other kinds of work should not disqualify by para aduma. Ta'ol bilvad ksiv, because it only says ol, it only talks about the yoke by para aduma. But what we do is we learn a kal v'chomer from egla, just like by egla arufa, other kinds of work disqualify. So too over here. It says asher lo ubad ba, we understand all kinds of work, and then we learn to para aduma. But if you're making this exclusion of ba, v'i ba miyuta, but if ba is an exclusion, lo nigmar minei, we shouldn't learn from egla arufa. And Rashi continues, Alama Amar Rav Yehuda hiniach al para oda shel sakin aguda shel sakin psula. So why did Rav Yehuda say by para aduma that if you put a bundle of sacks on top of the para aduma, that disqualifies? V'alfa gav delav olu, and even though that's not a yoke. Uvaliyah l'chudam ifsal, and not only that, just putting the bundle on top of the animal, that's enough to disqualify. Kedechsib bepara b'meleches ol ha'amura ba'asher lo ola ba'aliyah l'chudah. It says asher lo ola. We understand even just putting the burden on the animal is enough to disqualify it for para aduma. V'afilu shalom mashli, even if you didn't pull the animal at all. Uve'egla shetimshach. When it comes to egla arufa, you actually have to pull the animal. Shetataltel hamasa ma'at. You have to pull the the animal with the burden a little, because by the egla it talks about pulling it, and so that's a distinction between the para aduma and the egla arufa. But again, by both of them, it doesn't have to specifically be a yoke. And Rashi notes over here, lakamon parach, later on the Gemara will ask, Kevin the shara avodas b'para loksivi, since other kinds of work aren't even written by para aduma, egla yalfina, and everything is really being learned out from egla arufa. So amai mifsal ba'aliyah l'chuda. So why are we so strict by para that even just putting the burden, the package on top of the animal is enough to disqualify? The shar masoi she'eno ol mamish. Again, we're talking about a situation of other burdens that are not actually a yoke. So if we're learning from egla arufa, why is it that we're stricter by para aduma when it comes to putting things on top of the animal than we're stricter by para aduma than we are by egla arufa itself? Mikol makam, but Rashi says nevertheless, shma mino, we do see from here the gamar para me egla v'kal v'chomer, that we learn para aduma from egla arufa with a kal v'chomer b'shar avodas, in terms of other kinds of avoda that disqualify v'af agav dechsiv ba miut, even though it says the word ba, which should be an exclusion. And Rashi continues, the Gemara talked about avodas isra, a prohibited kind of work. What does that refer to? Kagon b'Shabbos, or kilayim b'shor v'chamor. You could have work that's done on Shabbos with the animal. That's a prohibited kind of work. Or you could have work that's done in terms of kilayim. You do a shor and a chamor together. And so then the Gemara went on to say, avodas isur nami mehaikra nafka. That same pasuk, those same psukim that are dealing with blemishes, that also tells us that avodas isur is not a disqualification when it comes to kachim. Dekevin the trei kroi ksivi al karcha chad minayu la avodas isur. Since there are two psukim, so one of them is obviously excluding avodas isur as well as avodas heter. All kinds of avoda, they do not disqualify when it comes to kachim. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we said above. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Hiniachala oda shal sakin. If he put on the para aduma a bundle of sacks, psula, that disqualifies it. That's considered malacha. It's considered work. Uve eglin, when it comes to egel arufa acha timshach, it's not enough just to put the burden on the animal. You actually have to pull the animal as well. Only then it becomes disqualified. And the Gemara continues, Meisveh, we have a question from the following brisa. Ol, so it says a yoke, ainli ala ol, I only know that the disqualification occurs when you use a yoke, talking about the para aduma. Shar avodos minayin, how do we know that other types of work as well create the disqualification? Amrid kal v'chomer, we make the following kal v'chomer. Uma egla she'en mum posel ba shar avodos poslos, but if by the egla arufa, where there's no disqualification of a blemish, but other kinds of work do disqualify it, so para she'mum posel ba, so when it comes to para aduma, where a blemish is a disqualification, ain't no din sheshar avodos poslin ba, isn't it logical to say that other forms of work are also considered disqualifications? And the Brisa continues, Vim nafshach lomar, now if you're going to have some kind of a refutation to this, nemar kan ol, so it says over here the word ol, v'nemar lahalan ol, and it says over there the word ol, malahalan shar avodos poslosba, again, just like over there, when it comes to the egla arufa, other kinds of work create the disqualification. Afkan, so too over here, when it comes to para aduma, shar avodos poslos, other kinds of work are also going to create the disqualification. And the Gemara now clarifies the Brisa. Mayim nafshach lomer. What does it mean when the Brisa says that if you have some kind of argument against what we said? And the Gemara says as follows. V'chiteim, if you're going to suggest as follows, because we're trying to say a kal v'chomer over here, that by egla arufa there's no disqualification of mum, and other avodos are disqualification, so by para aduma where there is a disqualification of mum, certainly there should be disqualification of other avodos, but you might say, v'chiteim, you might say, ikal mifrach, there's a refutation to this kal v'chomer, mala egla shekain shanim poslos, because what's true by egla arufa, what's unique by egla arufa, you also have another kind of a disqualification, that's the disqualification of age. It has to be a certain age to be kosher for egla arufa, as we said above. Inami, or you could say kachim yochichu. You can say that kachim, when it comes to karbanos, animals that are designated for karbanos, that proves the kal v'chomer incorrect. Shemum posel ben, because when it comes to kachim, a mum, a blemish, is a disqualification. Ve'ein avoda poselos ben. Yet we see over there that work is not a disqualification, and so that's why the Brisa says. So if the kal v'chomer is not going to work, if you're going to attempt to refute the kal v'chomer, we can make the following gezerah shaveh. Nemer kan ol v'nemer lahalan ol. It says over here ol, and it says over there ol. Ma lahalan shar avodas, just like over there, meaning when you're talking about egla arufa, other kinds of avoda are also disqualifications. Afkan shar avodos. So too, over here, when you're talking about para aduma, other kinds of avoda are disqualifications. And the Gemara says, when we makam shabasa, now if you're learning out from egla arufa ultimately, so we should say as follows, ma'alahalan acha timshoch, just like over there, you have to actually pull the animal by egla arufa. So afkan acha timshoch, if you're learning from egla arufa, that's where you're learning para aduma, so it should be true by para aduma also, it should only be when you actually pull the animal with the load, and so therefore that's the question of the Gemara and what Rav said, because Rav made a distinction, he said only by egla arufa, it's when you pull the animal with the load, but when it comes to para aduma, when you just put it on top of the animal, that's enough. And the Gemara answers, Tanoihi, you're right, actually this is a machlokas Tanoim. The brisa we just quoted does go against Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, but there is another Tana, and that's where Rav Yehuda Amar Rav follows, the Ika Demaisi La Me'egla, because there are those who learn Para Aduma, the disqualification of labor by Para Aduma, from Egla Arufa. That's the brisa we just quoted above. But Ika Demaisi La Migufa de Para, but there are those who learn it from Para Aduma itself. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Ol, it says a yoke by Para Aduma, Ein Li Ela Ol, I only know a yoke, Shar Avodos Minayin, how do we know other kinds of avodos, other kinds of labor? Talmud Lomer Asher Lo Allah Aleh Ol. The pasuk says Asher Lo Allah Aleh Ol. That's an inclusion. Mikol Makom, and it means any kind of labor. Imkain, if so, Ma Talmud Lomer Ol. So why does the pasuk say Ol? And the idea is Ol Posel Bein B'Shas Avoda Bein Shalo B'Shas Avoda. The yoke is able to disqualify whether at the time the labor is being done or even not at the time of the labor. But Shar Avodas, when it comes to other kinds of labor, Ein Poslos Ela B'Shas Avoda. They only create the disqualification at the time of the actual avoda. And Rashi over here explains Shalo b'shas avoda. What does it mean? Not at the time of the labor. Va'afilu hinichu aleh lohakel masa miyada v'lo limshoch. Let's say he put it by the yoke. Let's say he put it on. He just wants to take the burden off of his hands, but he has no intention of actually doing labor. Ela b'shas avoda. But other kinds of labor, it has to be b'shas avoda. What that means is, kolomar, what it means to say is sha'avoda zu l'tzorachi. It means there's a real need for the avoda. Aval akroi bi'alma sheiniach sak aleh v'lo l'holicho. But let's say it just happens to be he puts a burden on there, but it's not for the purpose of pulling it. Ela ikri v'osiv lo, but he just happens to put it. Ela ikri v'osiv lo pasel. That's not going to create the disqualification. But the Gemara continues, Ve'ima asher lo Allah aleha klal ol prat. Why don't we say that when it says in the pasuk asher lo Allah aleha, that's a general idea of labor, and ol is a specific, meaning a yoke specifically, and we should say as follows, klalu prat, ein bechlal alamasha beprat. When you have a klalu prat, the rule is we only follow the prat, and the only thing that should create the disqualification is a yoke. Ol in midi achrina lo, maybe it should only apply to an ol, a yoke, and nothing else. And to that the Gemara says, Asher ribuyahu. The word Asher, that's an inclusion, and that's how we include these other forms of labor. And the Gemara continues, V'tanya nami gabe egla ki agavna. We have a similar brisa by Egla Arufa as well. Ol ein li ala ol. Again, it says a yoke. I only know a yoke. Shar avodas minayin. How do we know that other kinds of labor are also going to be a disqualification by Egla Arufa? Talmud lomer asher lo ubad ba mikol makom. The pasuk says asher lo ubad ba, and we understand any kind of labor. In kain ma Talmud lomer ol. If that's the case, why does the pasuk say ol? And the Gemara says the same answer. Ol posel bein b'shas avoda bein shalo b'shas avoda. When it comes to a yoke, that disqualifies whether it's at the time of doing work, meaning again, as Rashi explained, with the intention that you're actually doing work, or even in a situation where you're just putting it on and there's no intention of doing work. Shar avodos, but when it comes to other avodos, ein poslos ela b'shas avoda. They only create the disqualification if it's at the time of labor, there's actually an intention of doing work. And the Gemara says, Ve'ema asher lo ubad ba klal, ol prat. The Gemara asks the same question. Why don't we say asher lo ubad ba is a general, and ol is a prat, that's a specific, and we'll say klal prat, ein b'chlal l'masha b'prat. We'll say when you have a klal prat, we only follow the specifics, ol in midi achrina lo, only by an ol and nothing else. And again, the Gemara answers, asher ribuyahu, that asher is an inclusion. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Avo says, Boy minei Rabbi Yochanan, they asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question, Meshichas ol bekama, we said by the Egla Arufa, that you have to pull the animal in order to create the disqualification. How far do you have to pull the yoke? How far of a distance do you pull the animal? Amar Lei said to him, Kamole ol, you have to pull it like the size of the yoke itself. Iboilahu, they asked the following question, La orko la rachbo, are we talking about the length of the yoke, or is it the distance of the width of the yoke? Amar lahu hahume rabbonan for Rabbi Yaakov Shemei, so he said to him, one of the scholars said to him, and his name was Rabbi Yaakov, Ledidi mefarshali mine de Rabbi Yochanan, to me it was explained in the name of Rabbi Yochanan the following, Meshichas ol, when we're talking about pulling the animal by the yoke, l'rachvo tefach, it's according to the width of the yoke, and the distance is the distance of a tefach. And the Gemara says, V'lei ma tefach. Well, if that's the case, so why didn't he just say a tefach? Why is he saying it's the width of the yoke, which is a tefach? And the Gemara says, Hakamash Malan, it's to teach us, Shiura de ol tefach have, that the measurement of an ol is one tefach. Lamai nafkamina, what difference does it make how large an ol is? The difference is, Lameka chumemkar, makes a difference for purchasing and for selling. You have to know the dimensions. If you make a deal that involves an ol, we have to understand what the size of an ol is. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Shol. Rabbi Yochanan ben Shol says, B'mnei ma amra Torah, why does the Torah say, and the Torah says, Hevi egla benachal. Why does it say that you have to bring the egla arufa to the nachal, to again either the stream or the valley? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Yavo davar shelo asa peiros, bring something that has not brought forth any fruit. And let's break its neck, let's decapitate it in a place which doesn't produce fruit. And that will be an atonement on this person who wasn't allowed to create fruits. So that's the idea why it's you bring this egla benachal, because the egla is an animal that hasn't produced any fruits, and then you're bringing it to an area where there's no fruits, and that's a kapara because this individual was killed and he's not able to bear fruits. My peiros, what kind of fruits are we talking about that this individual is not able to bear? Ilema pirya v'ribbi. If we mean to say that he's not able to have children because he now has died, elameata. But according to that, azakin v'asaris. Let's say you have a person who's elderly, or let's say you have a man who's not able to have children. Hachanami delo arfinan. Will we say the same thing that you're not going to do egla rufa over there because now this person couldn't have children anyway? Ella, rather, the Gemara says mitzvahs. What we mean to say is that he's no longer alive and he's not able to bear fruits, meaning to say he's not able to perform mitzvahs. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Umoridin osa el nachal eson, eson kemashmo kasha." We said we bring him down to this nachal, which is eson. And what does eson mean? Eson means that it's hard. And the Gemara says, "Tanu Rabbanan," the rabbis taught, "Minayin la eson shu kasha." How do we know that eson means kasha, that it means hard? Shenemar, as it says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis.